All right, so my name is Melissa Zablonski. I am a social studies teacher and faculty coordinator for our humanities department at Putnam High School, which is in northeastern Connecticut, if you didn't know. And this was our first year teaching the Black and Latino studies course at our school. And it was definitely a challenge, and it was great that the state put forth so many resources and lesson ideas for us. And one of the ones that we really kind of took and ran with and expanded on a bit was about Nat Turner's Rebellion. And so I wanted to share with you a couple lessons that I did to extend what the state had put out there for Nat Turner that really engaged my students and really made them excited to learn about slave resistance and abolitionism and the like. All right, so can you see my screen switch? Or is it paused? Hold on, let me see, pause. Oh, resume share. See it now? Okay, sweet. All right. So where do these lessons fit? It's basically two lessons that we expanded upon. And within the Black and Latino Studies curriculum, semester one is focusing on the African American and Black studies. And the third unit of the state curriculum is Black literacy, organizations, and liberation. And Nat Turner is briefly addressed in lesson 3.2. And when we started talking about Nat Turner, my students were super intrigued because they had never heard of him before. They had heard of kind of the big hero names like Harriet Tubman and MLK, but they hadn't heard of Nat Turner. And so I use this as an opportunity to really get them even more engaged in history, because as we know, sometimes that can be a little bit difficult to do with the students. So the first lesson that we did was an overview of Nat Turner's Rebellion and an analysis of reactions that were in response to the rebellion. So we started off with a video summary of his rebellion, which was included within the state curriculum. I think it's about a 9-minute video or so, and it does a really nice job of just laying out how everything unfolded. So Nat Turner has his vision, and then how he kind of recruits people and then goes on and carries out his rebellion, how they're searching for him, how he's caught. And it does a really nice job of clearly laying that out for students. After we watched that, we dug into some primary sources that were related to reactions to the rebellion. And throughout this whole first lesson, we're really focusing on the two essential questions that are part of this Unit 3 of the Black and Latino Studies curriculum. And those were, when is resistance justified, glorified, and condemned? And how effective were the actions of abolitionists and slave rebellions during this period? And I really love the way the state worked these essential questions into the unit, because I think it allows for the students to have some really deep discussions and really think critically about, okay, slavery is such a terrible thing, but then also, when is resistance to it? When should we justify it, glorify it, or condemn it? It was a challenge for these students, and I'll get more into that in a minute. And so the real objective for this first lesson was for students to evaluate the actions and the reactions of Nat Turner's rebellion by analyzing primary sources so that they could determine overall the effectiveness of the rebellion. Did Nat Turner achieve the goals he was hoping for, or help improve the conditions of the enslaved as a result of his rebellion? So, as I said, we start off by watching the video about Nat Turner's Rebellion. And following that, on the board, the students go up, and I usually have a volunteer go up, and we just go through a discussion where students started creating a timeline of events throughout the whole class. So everyone's kind of just spitting out what they remember from the video. We're correcting each other. We're walking through everything that happened. And after it's clear that the students have a really good idea of the rebellion itself, we talk about that first essential question: should the rebellion be justified, glorified, or condemned? And there's a lot of different answers to this one. A lot of students say, absolutely, it should be justified because, slavery is not a justifiable act. Slavery shouldn't be a thing. It's dehumanizing. So of course, what Nat Turner did was justified. But then we have students saying, no, it should be condemned because he killed women, children, families in the name of the cause, and that's not something that should be justified or glorified, no matter the situation. So just through those first basic events of the rebellion, students are already getting engaged in this kind of debate of, is this right or is this wrong? And so next, what students do, they work either individually or in small groups. I like to give them the choice, and they analyze primary sources that detail the reactions to the rebellion. And after that activity as a class, we go back to the second essential question, and we ask, how effective was Nat Turner's rebellion at improving conditions of the enslaved? The purpose being, all right, based on these reactions, did he advance the cause? Did his rebellion advance the position of the enslaved, advance the position of freed Blacks? So I have just a couple screenshots here. I adapted these materials from this lesson that's linked here. And afterwards, if I can put my email in the chat, or Jenny can put it in the chat. And if you want copies of this, I'm more than happy to share them with you via email. So when the students go into their stations, or rotate through these stations, they can do it on the computer. I have printed copies out as well for them. But they're looking at 8 different sources. Some of them, as you can see here, are just like accounts or letters or like diary entries, and they're very short. So eight sources sounds like a lot, but they're all about this length or so. So they're looking at letters, they're looking at proclamations, they're looking at lists of laws that were passed following the rebellion. And we're asking students to do 3 things when they're looking at each document. What does the document say? So just in their own words, what is the gist of the document? How is Nat Turner portrayed? And that one's a little tricky because some of them don't necessarily refer to Nat Turner explicitly, even though they're all related to him. So for example, this right here is a letter that was written, or a response to a letter that was written about the fact that free men of color are no longer allowed to preach after the rebellion. So kind of thinking in this case critically, how does this portray Nat Turner and what he did? Well, it's definitely a negative light if now Nat Turner, who was known as a preacher within his community, now because of what he's done, other men are no longer allowed to preach. So it's portraying Nat Turner in more of a negative light. And then the last thing they're looking at with each document is, what does this tell us about the effectiveness of slave rebellions and resistance, specifically Nat Turner's? So they're going through each of these documents, they're filling out the chart, and then at the end, they're just looking at how effective overall do you think Nat Turner's rebellion was? And I'm asking them to use at least 4 pieces of evidence in their explanation. So students are now having an idea of, right, this is what happened, these were the outcomes, what was it that was achieved, and was it something that actually helped the cause? And so after that, we regroup as a class and we have a discussion about that last question: how effective do you think the rebellion was? And so that's the first lesson that kind of extends on the Nat Turner Rebellion as it is in the state curriculum. And the second lesson is a source analysis and debate. And this is lesson 2. And just for reference as well, we have 90-minute block periods at my high school, and we meet every other day. So we have a nice chunk of time each day. This lesson, honestly, I could have done a whole nother day with it. And I think this coming year, I absolutely will. We were just crunched for time this year. And I mentioned that at the end as well, some reflections that I have and things I would do differently. But for this second lesson, they're analyzing sources, and then we ended up engaging in kind of an informal, like, mini debate at the end of the lesson. So we opened up with a do now question. We recapped the rebellion itself. The students moved through stations once again. They wrote a letter to Congress about whether or not Nat Turner should be remembered as a hero or a terrorist. And then we had our little mini debate. So the essential questions we were really focusing on with this activity was, how should Nat Turner and his rebellion be remembered? And then also, in what ways did his rebellion help and harm the abolitionist cause? So the whole objective was for students to, after analyzing the different perspectives of Nat Turner, evaluate whether he should be remembered as a hero or a terrorist. And those are really loaded terms. They can be polarizing terms. They're controversial terms to use, but I felt like using the terms hero or terrorist was going to stir up a lot more discussion among students than just saying, should he be remembered as a good person or a bad person? So they're absolutely loaded terms. They're absolutely polarizing and on opposite ends of the spectrum. But the conversations that got going just because of the terms themselves was incredible. So this is kind of how the lesson unfolded. So we do a do now activity every day, whether it's a question, some kind of discussion. And this one, we did a four corners activity for our do now when they came into class, and they had to do it in response to the following prompt. So one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter was a quote that was displayed on the board. And students had to strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree and go to the respective corners in the room. And this was a great way to kick off the lesson because it started some good conversations. A lot of students were in the agree or the disagree corners of the room. And a lot of them said, well, no, if you're a terrorist, you can't be a freedom fighter because a terrorist is someone who does a bad thing. It's black or white. You can't, if you do something bad, the thing that you've done is bad to everybody. Whereas we had other students say, well, what about with September 11th? We see those men that hijacked those planes and killed those people as terrorists, but the groups that they were working for saw them as martyrs and freedom fighters and doing something for a cause. So even though we don't agree with what they did and we see them as terrorists, other people don't see it that way. And so it really opened up a great discussion about perspective and how perspectives on the same issue can really widely differ on very extreme ends. So after that, we transitioned just to a recap of what happened, what we had learned the previous class about Nat Turner's Rebellion. So we had a T-chart on the board. The left side said what happened, and that's where we just kind of, again, walked through the events of the rebellion. And the other side said what were the outcomes. And that's where we walked through what students had picked up from the sources in the previous class. So what were some of the things that happened as a result of the rebellion, such as more restrictions on the enslaved. After that, students visited 5 stations around the room, and each station had a source that provided a perspective on how Nat Turner should be remembered, either as a hero or a terrorist. Now, not all the sources they were given used those terms, hero or terrorist, but they were all secondary sources, except for one, which was a poem. But they were all secondary sources that really evaluated from more of a current perspective, or at least within the last 20 years or so perspective of how this event should be remembered. Was what Nat Turner did justified? Is it something that we should condemn? And at each station, they completed an analysis chart, which I'll show in a second. After they engaged with all the stations, students answered the essential questions, and they also wrote a short letter to Congress to argue whether Nat Turner should be recognized as a national hero or a terrorist. These writing pieces, so this is where I would definitely extend it into, I think, a whole nother full day, where I would give students time during this class to really write and then another full day to really discuss, because by the time they got through the stations and they were at this writing piece, some of them were literally just jumping out of their skin wanting to talk and argue, and it was incredible. They were really ready to discuss these questions and discuss their perspectives. So we did kind of cut the writing piece short just to get them to discuss, because it was very clear that that's what they wanted to do. And I should point out as well, we didn't define hero or terrorist as a class before we started this. And I would say it was probably around the time that students got to their second station that they started to say, or I started to hear as I was circulating the room, we should look up the definitions to this. And so they're looking up the definition of a hero. And I hear them saying, oh, it's someone who does like a courageous act. And then, oh, but a terrorist is somebody that does something with violence for a political aim, and then discussing in their groups, well, where the heck can Nat Turner fall on that spectrum, because he has qualities of both. So it's really cool to see them engage in that other inquiry step where they're looking up those definitions to come to their own conclusions. So after they are supposed to write on their short letter to Congress and answer those essential questions, what I did was I put a poll everywhere up on the board. If you haven't used that, it's super easy. You just make it a count. You throw up a question. So in this case, it was, should Nat Turner be considered a hero or a terrorist? And then you give options for the students, and they can either put the link in on their computer and vote, or they can text their answer to a number that goes across the screen. And as people vote and the votes roll in, they can see, like on a bar graph, they can see it changing in real time on the screen. And so when students were just ready to talk, we kind of cut the writing piece short, and I put the poll everywhere up, and we just watched as the votes rolled in, and it was almost a 50-50 split. And students were so excited and just busting at the seams to talk. Like, if the student that thought Nat Turner was a hero saw the terrorist answer squeak up by a couple percentage points, they were ready to argue, and they were ready to throw down and say what they were thinking. So we really, after that, got into this really great discussion about whether or not Nat Turner should be considered a hero or a terrorist, and what that really means in terms of slave rebellions and what's justifiable when it comes to such an inhumane institution. So here's just some examples of the sources that I used for this activity. So with their analysis chart, I included the essential questions at the top for them to remember. And one of the other ones that I didn't put on the other slide was a quote from Anderson Cooper from the article that's screenshotted here. And Anderson Cooper said, "To fight something which is so unjust, what is justifiable, and what role does violence play in that?" And that was really where the heat of our debate kind of stuck, is, all right, slavery is so incredibly unjustifiable, and to what extent can violence be justified in order to fight against that? So we had those questions there as a reminder. And then for each of the sources, the students were reading them together in their group. They were noting down the author's perspective of Nat Turner. So basically, whether the author felt that what he did was justifiable, what he did was heroic, or the opposite. In the next column, they had to provide evidence to support the author's perspective. So if they said that the author thinks Nat Turner was a freedom fighter and, sacrificed for his cause, they would need to put evidence, whether quotes or paraphrase information in that second column, that really proved that. And then they had to decide if they agreed or disagreed with what the author was arguing. So after that, we had each of those questions there. And like I said, we kind of rushed through this written piece a little bit just because the kids were just so ready to talk. So they had the 2 questions to answer. They ended up doing most of this part for homework. So they answered Anderson Cooper's question. They answered, in what ways did the rebellion help and harm the abolitionist cause? And then they wrote a short letter to Congress that argued whether we should formally recognize Nat Turner as a hero or a terrorist. And then here's just a quick little snippet of one of the sources. It's from CBS, and this was the Anderson Cooper source. And basically, this source focused on the descendants of the rebellion. So they had, they interviewed a descendant of one of the families that Nat Turner killed. It happened that this person's, I think, great-grandmother hid in a closet and was able to survive. So they were able to interview him on his perspective. And they also interviewed a descendant of Nat Turner on their perspective of what had happened. So there were some pretty interesting sources that the students were able to engage with in order to kind of come to their conclusions. And so unfortunately, I don't have like a nice recording of the debate that we got into, and I wish I did, because it was so rich, and there were students who never speak that were just so passionate about this topic. But here are some student samples of what they did do in the quick time that they wrote their letters to Congress and when they filled out their charts. So they're not edited, but like the first one, for example: "Dear Congress, I believe that Mr. Nat Turner should be remembered as a freedom fighter. I believe the terms terrorist and hero are way too extreme, as he fits these descriptions to a T based upon the definitions of these terms. He's neither a hero nor a terrorist. What he did was needed for slaves to be hopeful that one day they would become free. The actions that took place were wrong, no doubt, but it was needed for people to speak up on what they believe in. Nat Turner did what many people would never ever even think about doing. This helped lead people to freedom, so it must be brought up in discussion. To not remember him would be an insult." So this person had a hard time kind of choosing if he would say hero or terrorist. And one of the big arguments that a lot of students brought up was, yeah, what Nat Turner did was absolutely terrible and absolutely violent, but he didn't have any other method to go about to be heard. He couldn't protest. He couldn't, if he wrote a letter or had someone write a letter for him, it wouldn't be taken seriously. So what other option did he have but to do what he did? So that was a big argument that students brought up as well. But then on the other spectrum, we also had a student write that Nat Turner is not a hero, but not necessarily a terrorist. But if I were forced to choose between the two words, I would have to go with terrorist. Nat Turner's ideas and final goals were good, but the way he went about it was not. He made sure to kill any white family he saw, including the women and children. Uprisings and rebellions such as this should not be directed to civilians, and Nat Turner went around slaughtering family after family to prove his point. If he had the ideal of a peaceful protest, slaves could have had freedom and equality quicker. So that idea of he should have used a different method than what he did to achieve his goals is being brought up in that letter. And then over here is just an example of some of what a student filled out in his chart. So for the first source, he says, the author doesn't really have a specific opinion. It depends on who you ask. And he agreed. He said he kind of has a middle view of that situation. It was a bad act that he did, but the purpose of the fight and what they were fighting for was something that was good. So it was really great to see students dive into these sources, use that in their writing. But like I said, most of this ended up being really discussion based in the end because they were just ready to talk as a class. And I think it was one of the few times where I had every single student participate and have something to say. And this class was at 8 o'clock in the morning. So it was great to see that they were ready to go and talk about this. So it was really awesome to see the conversation that it stimulated. So like I said before, some of my thoughts for next time. So next year, I'm definitely going to do this lesson again. And I think what I would do, aside from just written sources, which is what I did for that second lesson, I would include more videos, pictures, and other media in the station to help them evaluate whether or not they believe Nat Turner was a hero or terrorist, just to switch it up and give them more, just more diversity in what it is they're looking at. I think I would shift from written responses to a structured discussion as well. So have them do those written responses at the end of class, but then the next day, continue this into a third day, have them have more of a structured discussion that they can use to prepare for a more formal debate that we have on that third day. And I think that this year, I'll definitely make sure that I plan to have enough time for that. Teaching Black and Latino studies for the first time this year was a little overwhelming and crazy, just with trying to plan everything and fit all the content in and trying to also stay on pace with the state curriculum. So this year, now that I'm more comfortable with it, I think I would definitely feel more comfortable spending an extra day on this, just because of how well it went and just because of really how engaged the students were. So those were some of my takeaways as I reflected on the lesson and some of the things that I would do differently. So that's what I have for you. Like I said, I can absolutely share these sources with you. But if you guys have any questions, if you have any suggestions to make this better or how you would use it, or you just have any thoughts in general, I would love to hear what you guys think or how you teach Nat Turner in your courses. Anything, I would just love to open it up. So thank you.